Oh, well done. I should test everyone to see who can say Öqvist. If you can't, you have to leave the room now. Okay, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about, it sounds a little bit boring, GDPR tools and techniques, but I'm going to make it a little bit cool. It won't be too boring. And of course, a lot of you guys are legal guys, so you know everything's boring in any case, according to people I talk to who think legal and compliance and everything that we work with is boring. Now, what I thought I'd do first is I'm just going to show you a bit of a, this is me, okay? I'm not going to talk about me anymore. You have 30 seconds or 20 seconds to consume and then we move on. But basically, I know what I'm talking about. Right, are you ready to move on? If you want my business card after this, I have some. Now, we all know what the Data Protection Act is. Here in the UK, I think it is 1998. It's based on the EU Data Protection Regulation that came into effect in 95. But what people don't really talk about that much is, you know, it's about protecting personal data, we know that much, but who actually owns personal data? Is it the controller? But who is the controller? Now, does everybody know what I mean by data protection? Yes? Everybody know what I mean when I talk about personal data, personal identifying information, okay? So now a data controller is the legal entity that collects personal data. Data controller and or processor. Now it could be that an organization is outsourcing their operations. This is called the processor, because the controller is collecting personal data and the processor processes them, stores it, they could share it, they could do a whole load of stuff. The controller can also be a processor, both of them. Is it the data subject who owns personal data? And who is the data subject? Good, yeah, you have absolutely no rights when you're dead. We need to fix that. It's actually becoming a problem. Okay, is it the data controller only if you have consent of the data subject? Consent is when you tick that box and say, yes, I consent to you collecting and processing, using, sharing, whatever, my personal data. Now, nowadays, you can have implicit consent, which is implied by your behavior or by your actions. So on a website, they will have things like, you know, by continuing to use this service, you consent that we can put a cookie on your computer and we can collect your personal data. Explicit consent is the tick box, and that is actually mandatory for sensitive data and for parental consent and stuff like that in the GDPR. But we'll talk more about these details later. And then there's also something called unambiguous consent, and we will take that later too because it's a little bit complex. So, who owns personal data? Can I have a vote on number 1? Well, it's not a number there, but the first one. The data controller. I knew you wouldn't let me down, David. So, should we have a vote on, I don't think anyone will choose number 2, but what about number 3? The data subject. What about the last point? If you get consent of the data subject, the controller owns personal data. Nobody? Yeah? You know, it's very complex because, well, it's not complex, it's a very fundamental thing. If you get this wrong, you get it all wrong. The biggest challenge for guys like me and security guys, technical guys, is that we are so used to protecting the organization's intellectual property that it never occurs to us that personal data, in fact, belongs to the data subject. And the General Data Protection Regulation that will be implemented on the 25th of May 2018 has an enormous chapter, this big, okay, it's exaggerating, but it feels a lot when you're reading it, on the rights of the data subject. The EU Data Protection Regulation will replace the Data Protection Act implemented in every EU member state, which includes the UK 98 Data Protection Act. Yeah? So I'm sort of getting the basics here. Some things may be obvious to you, but I'm making an assumption that it's not. So, and what is personal data? Has everybody heard about personal identifying information? Yeah? Okay, this is defined in the directive, and they added a couple of years ago something called, or maybe it was more than a couple of years, time flies when you're having fun. But they added IP address there, but it's your personal attributes such as your name, your address, could be your personal ID if you live in Sweden, telephone number, and also your IP address. However, this is the definition in the regulation. It is basically anything that individually that's connected to a living person. You have to be alive, and it doesn't need to be personal data that identifies you directly. It can be personal data that, when combined, will actually point towards you or link to you in some way. And this is basically in response to the advances in technology with data mining and intelligent correlation and all this type of stuff. Any questions?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense given the original definition under the UTA 1998 biographical. So, yeah.
Good. Thank you. Yeah, so, and this is why it's so complex, and this is why it's such a problem, because it could be, it can be linked. Your IP address is actually personal identifying information according to the directive, and so your MAC address, for example, on a mobile telephone, you actually have your telephone number, which links to you. You have your telephone actually has two hardware addresses. I can't remember exactly what they are, but both of them have different sort of functions. But one of them is like a MAC address, and one of them is like another hardware address. But yeah, they can be defined as personal data in the GDPR. If I'm using acronyms and I forgot to explain what they are, just put up your hand and remind me, if you wouldn't mind. Yes? Yeah, I think this needs to be changed because there is a lot of issues there, but that is what they have written in the regulation. I can't answer your question. Yeah, and there is some, you want to talk to this lady here, Sarah, she's hopping mad about something happening on Facebook, because apparently if somebody dies and then you have this like memorial or something on there and somebody else takes over your, just to say that you're dead and you have this memorial plate, apparently they don't have the rights to delete that personal data. The right to delete disappears. Yeah. And it's because of this fact you do not have any rights if you are a deceased person.
So natural is the same as living.
Yeah, so don't die basically. Okay, now, me coming from an IT world and a security world, I get quite frustrated sometimes because my colleagues, they tell me, privacy equals security. Great. After all, in the ISO 27002 control framework, it's got some data protection controls, and we just tick the boxes. That works, doesn't it? So basically, the way that I actually explain to them is that, you need security for privacy. It's a subset of privacy, and you can't see it in any other way. Another base rule on personal data and the GDPR. You get this wrong, you get it all wrong. Now, funnily enough, traditionally, this challenge with compliance with data protection acts in every EU member state has fallen in the arms of the legal guys, of course, because that's what they're good at. Privacy policies, notices, and all this type of stuff. So it makes absolute sense. However, because of the 4%, up to 44% fines on global turnover of organizations, if you happen to lose personal data, or you happen to demonstrate beyond a doubt that you are negligent, you are not fit custodians of personal data. Because one part of the GDPR is you have to demonstrate that you are fit custodians. They don't actually use the word fit custodians. I've taken that because I sort of see that you are a custodian to personal data just as you would be custodian if you wanted to adopt or foster a child. You have to have the same amount of care and consideration and due diligence. Now, where was I? Yeah. So basically, before even the directive was created, there has been defined 8 privacy principles. The Organization of Economic Development devised them in 1980. Before this, actually, the Americans devised something. So this is based upon FIPS principles, the Fair Information Privacy Practices from 1973. So it's nothing new. And in fact, these 8 principles are more, because what I was saying before, and I lost the track, is to do with who had this responsibility before was the legal guys. Now, because it's landed at the board level, this hot potato, the board don't want this, it's horrible, so they give it to the CIO, and he thinks, where do I put this problem? And he gives it to his compliance guys. The compliance guys in a lot of organizations, fortunately or unfortunately, don't know anything about law, but they think they know about this, because after all, they know about compliance and they tick boxes. So, one of the tasks that I sort of set myself last year, beginning of last year, is to find a way to explain to compliance guys that do not eat legal jargon for breakfast how to be sure to know when to call in the legal guys. When do you call in the troops? Because otherwise they won't do it, because they don't get it. So I found this, and I thought, oh my God, this is so easy to understand. Collection limitation principle. Collect only what's needed for the purpose and get consent. Data quality principle. It's not security, it's not integrity of data like the CIA triad in information security. We as individuals, we change house, we get new telephones, new IP addresses, change names sometimes. Our personal data changes. And data quality is for the requirement to ensure personal data is kept up to date. There we come to purpose specification principle. There must be a purpose for personal data that you collect. If you don't have a purpose, what I call a purpose mismatch, you shouldn't be collecting it. I also use the purpose specification principle for these compliance guys who are, they normally have project managers in their team to explain this is how you scope your privacy impact assessment project. What is the purpose? And they get that, so that's cool. Use limitation principle. Use of personal data should be aligned to the purpose. So when I say there's a use mismatch, it means that there is some use internally for personal data, but it's not aligned to the purpose. So an example, you buy a book on Amazon.com, and you do this online, you leave your name and address because they need to deliver the book to you. So you share your personal data with Amazon.com. Now, the use of your personal data is to share your name and your address with the delivery department so that they can deliver your book. So you have a use aligned to a purpose. Now, it could also be, not could, it's the case, that they drop a cookie on your computer. Now, they will say this is to improve your user experience, but we all know better than that, don't we? And this is a useful marketing department. So the information, the personal data gathered from the cookie is mapped to a purpose of marketing, increased revenue, more customers, whereas the personal data collected for the order of your book goes to the delivery department. What this means internally is that you may actually have to duplicate data so that you're not sharing the use between different departments. So the delivery department only get your name and address, and the marketing department, or whoever the guys are underneath, they only get the cookie stuff. They don't get your delivery stuff. Okay? Any questions? Security safeguards principle. Now, this is where the security controls come in. And security is used to, you need security to ensure privacy. And we talk about the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, availability, and there's accountability, there's other auditability and stuff like that. But we don't need to go there too much. But basically, that is about as far as it goes with security. Of course, there is some other, we'll talk about another security thing in a moment with openness principle. That is, just thought I got this here, but I'm a bit warm now. Shall I open the door? Because I can see people are getting a little bit, people are getting a bit, I was thinking of dancing or something on the table, but Yeah, you're right. It's going to be, it's very challenging. So, and we'll take those. So, openness principle. It's the opportunity for the organization to show to their customers that they really care about them. It's the privacy notice. Individual participation principle. Now, security is about protecting data. When it comes to individual participation, you need to, the user, the individual, the data subject has the right to know if the controller is collecting personal data on them, what they're collecting, what are their security safeguards, who they are sharing it with. They have the right to know anything. They have a right to know what are your data handling practices. They have the right to ring up the data controller. So in the openness principle, you have to have, in the GDPR, the name and the contact details of the DPO, the data protection officer, so that he or she, could be either, can be contacted if there is a request for personal data. So, for example, I was at a conference at the Royal Holloway yesterday with the Information Security Group, and one of my old study guys there, he's actually in Switzerland, and what he did as an experiment is in Switzerland he orders the Financial Times. So he basically rang up the Financial Times office and said, or he sent an email to start with to say, I would like to have all personal data you have on me, if you would be so kind. And they replied and said, well, there will be a minimal charge of, it was £5 or £10 or something. Now with the GDPR, it shouldn't cost anything, but it's cost something nowadays. So there is this right in the Data Protection Act, which is good in UK. Then the problem is that he wasn't able to pay. Well, he was able to pay, but they only accepted British cheques. And of course, he's in Switzerland, so it was a bit of a problem. So they let him have it for free in the end. And he said, you know, it was quite empowering when 1 month later he got a packet of everything that he'd done, all the email communications, everything he'd done since he took out his subscription with the Financial Times 10 years earlier. That's what the rights of the data subject is about in the GDPR, and it's all about individual participation principle. Accountability principle. You as the data controller need to demonstrate that you are doing everything, and you need to have the evidence that you are doing everything that is stated in the previous 7. You will need to report to the Data Protection Authority, which is not yet set up, but will be. You will need to do things such as, if you're an organization that is, has subsidiaries over multiple legal jurisdictions within the EU or even outside of the EU, decide who is going to be the lead supervisory authority. And that will actually dictate accountability boundaries. You know, like when you have internal stuff going on, when you buy in services, who's the controller and who's the processor in your organization. Because within your organization, you can be both. Now, the way that I work, because I've been thinking about this a lot, I've actually taken these principles, which have been around for some time, and I've put it into like a 3 model, so that we can organize things in a way that makes sense in our organization. So you have the top-down stuff. And if you have a look on the right, you see, I say, okay, most probably everything to do with accountability, openness, and user participation will be at the program level. Most probably. Then you have the bottom-up. Now, has anybody heard about something called a Privasee impact assessment? Yeah? So you could have hundreds and thousands of these happening in your organization. So you need to find what are the, you know, I talked about an Amazon.com example earlier. So basically, for example, one data set would be the personal data that's collected at the web portal. Yeah, so that would be the entry point for your personal data and whatever happens to that. And you would be doing an assessment just on this data set. And you may find out that one data set actually is 2 data sets. But that's what happens when you're doing a Privasee impact assessment. Now, what I normally do is that at the top level, you have everything. You have the known knowns, you have your privacy program, you have your policies defined. You will have a privacy heat map so that you know, where are the known unknowns. The known unknowns, the stuff here, are personal data that you know is being collected, but you just have not documented it in a way that is, like the personal data lifecycle and stuff like this. We'll cover that afterwards. In a way that's compatible or compliant with the GDPR. So once you have, I call this packaging, but once you have packaged it or sealed it, then it becomes a known known. And you push it up to the program level. This is done, we know it, and we've sealed it, or we've done the PR on this, and so we're happy with this now. So here, you will have thousands. So an example of this could be your HR data. You know about this now, and this is what you can do to start with. You can actually do an inventory of everything that's obvious, the low-hanging fruit. What do you know about? HR data, your CRM system, a whole load of stuff going on that you're aware of. Now, the inside-out part. Now that's the bit that's scary. That is the invisible personal data in your organization. Personal data that's being collected and or processed that not even your employees are aware of, even though it's them that's doing it. It could be on Excel sheets, on USB sticks, it could be Word documents and email messages. Now, I call these the unknown unknowns. And down at the bottom level, at the inside out level, I sort of, this is where you got the people stuff going on. You need to have awareness training. You need to make sure that you have the internal privacy policies written and organized in a way so people can understand what they need to do in their work. You need to, what I recommend is to appropriate privacy champions across your organization. They may not be guys who are managers or in official roles, but they will be people I normally advise people that are influential. You know, they're the guys that everybody talks to at the coffee machines because they get to know everything that's going on. Now, once you've surfaced the unknown unknowns, you know, your employees say, okay, I'm collecting personal data, I know I'm doing this, and I'm processing it, I didn't realize, but okay, and you have a method, a process in place to capture this, then what happens, it will feed into this level where you conduct a privacy impact assessment. So, a privacy impact assessment. I have read privacy impact assessment guidelines that have been written by several countries globally. I've looked at Canada, I've looked at the US, I've looked at Victoria and Australia and other places in Australia, I've looked at New Zealand, anything that's in English, because it's too much trouble even to read the Swedish stuff. But the Swedish, they don't have anything actually, because their Data Protection Act is really bad. And it's long documents. They have some commonalities, but they are inconsistent. So I thought long about this, and I pulled out what I found was common amongst all of the guidelines that I found. And I created a 7-step PIA to go through, to be able to, what I call seal. And with customers I'm working with now, they talk about, now we're sealing. They say, Karen, when are we finished with this CRM seal? When are we finished with this? You know, this is a bottom-up thing. This is a, inside out. This is a top-down. You know the openness principle. We haven't dealt with the privacy notice that's in that. So this is terminology that people who are not legal, they just get it. It's so easy. I know it's not easy. It's a complex thing to do a privacy program, but it's about as easy as it's going to get, unless somebody else comes after me and finds a better way. So first of all, you identify a data set, whether this is your HR data or invisible data that's become known data or whatever, and you identify the entry points. Where is it coming from? Is it from a website? Is it from a mobile app? Is it from the shop floor? Is it from your sales guys? But the scope needs to be very defined. So if it's a CRM system, the entry point will be the input into the CRM system. Purpose necessity. What is the purpose for the collection of personal data? You notice a linkage with the 8 principles. And is the purpose in scope with your existing privacy policy? So are you collecting personal data that's different? It's like if you're in healthcare or pharmaceuticals and you may be doing some sort of clinical studies or whatever, and if you're doing something that's out of what you've normally done, I just like to check that the existing privacy notice, every time I do a PIA, I just check, do I need to push up to the program level that this is a new type of data and we may need to expand our privacy notice to take this into consideration? And you bring in the legal guys, of course. Accountability boundaries. Who is accountable? I talked earlier about the lead supervisory authority. And then you have something called the chairperson of the IPEP that I was with today, and he likes something called personal data supply chains, he calls them. You know, where is it coming from? Are you a controller? Are you a joint controller? What's a joint controller? Well, if you take a system where maybe you're a third party buying data and you're appending to that data, you become a joint controller. Are you a processor? And in the scope of one data set, you may actually have quite a lot of combinations that you never would have thought of before. Personal data lifecycle. This is about documenting personal data from the moment it's born within the scope of your PIA, privacy impact assessment, to when it dies or when it's destructed. So, you know, you collect personal data through a portal. You've already done your entry points, and then you've had a look to see, okay, how is this personal data stored? Is personal data shared beyond the original purpose? Is it destructed? You're looking at backups and things. How are backups? You know, it depends. If you're outsourcing and you have a processor involved, you just want to sort of see, okay, what are they? You know, what is there? Are they actually destroying backups and things in a way that's compatible? You won't go there. You just need to ask them, or with the GDPR, they're also equally liable. Or something that I need to state here actually is that today the controller is wholly responsible or liable for data loss. With the GDPR, there is equal liability between the controller and the processor. So what I see happening in the future is, whereas today you have SLAs, and SLOs are set from the controller to the processor, where you may outsource your environment, the controller may outsource the IT environment to a processor. Because of the reversal of, you know, the accountability balance, I see the processor doing the same thing with the controller to protect themselves, because they don't want to be held accountable for incompetence of the controller. For example, if the controller owns the identity, but it's actually provisioned through to the processor, you know, it needs to be, this is why the accountability boundaries is so important. If you get that wrong, you may be held liable for personal data that's lost, but it's not on in your territory, because of this equal liability of controller processor. And I don't think you share it 2-2. I think they're sort of just fining you for 4%. Use mapping. By the time I get to use mapping, I've sort of worked out whether there is a use mismatch. A use mismatch, I explained earlier, is where the use internally is not mapped into the purpose. And that's why I do this after the personal data lifecycle. Because by now, my data set is getting its own characteristics, its own character. It's getting a personality. Privacy risk assessment is not about corporate risk, it's not about security risk, it's not about financial risk. It's about what is the potential harm to the data subject if personal data becomes lost or stolen, or the integrity gets compromised in some way. So you may get risks that do impact, like, you know, you talk about the brand damage to an organization. But these risks, if you remember my diagram where I had these 3 circles, inside out, bottom up, top down. So this is a bottom up thing, this is a PIA. If it's a corporate risk to do with brand damage, I say to them that needs to be crossed, it's a corporate risk, it gets pushed up to the program level. Because otherwise, if you've got 100 peers going on in your organization, you will have 100 project groups, peers, doing brand damage. It just is not economically effective, basically. So you need to have a process in place that tells your, I call them a privacy impact team infrastructure, that tells them this is when you need to push it up. Legal compliance. Now, this is a cool part. This is the coolest part, actually, because what I've done here is, again, I haven't invented anything really. What I've taken is the ISO standard, the Privacy Framework 29100 standard. It's been around for ages, but nobody's been using it. Now, it has some similarities with the OECD privacy principles. So when I'm talking about the top-down, bottom-up, inside-out, I talk with the customer about these 8 principles. But when I'm going down to the detailed level, I've mapped in the GDPR, the 200 pages of legal text and stuff, into this here. So, for example, where you saw collection limitation principle with the OECD privacy principles, they've actually broken out in the ISO standards, so consent and choice is separate, which is pretty cool because it makes sense. So into consent and choice, I will have mapped in there things such as, have you got explicit consent? Are you getting consent from a child, an underage, under 16? Because the age in the EU is, they've actually defined the GDPR as 16, but every country has the choice to lower the age to as young as 13, which means if UK says, okay, we're going to do it 13, oh, by the way, if you happen to opt out of this Brexit thing, it still doesn't exempt you from all this stuff here. You still have to do business with the rest of the EU, just in case you were wondering of. So you would have things like parental consent. If it's healthcare data or sensitive data, if you need to have explicit consent. And so then you've got the purpose, legitimacy and specification. Of course, that's the purpose specification, collection limitation. Data minimization. With the OECD privacy principles, that was under use limitation, but they've broken it out. Data minimization, I talked about the Amazon.com example. The use, data minimization is that you only share data internally that's absolutely necessary. Accuracy and quality is the data quality. Openness, transparency, and notice. So, to my European colleagues who have English as a second or third language, I need to explain what the difference is between openness and transparency. And what I normally say, to make it simple, is openness, that is your privacy notice. And with transparency, you need to be on, if the data subject makes a request for personal data, you need to be transparent to say, yeah, we collect personal data, we've got this, and to have an open dialogue with them. Accountability, yeah, information security, we talked about that before, and privacy compliance. I think I'm actually in good time. I'm not finished yet, but privacy by design, why am I bringing this up now? Well, it's in the regulation, and what is it? A privacy impact assessment is an example of privacy by design. It's basically about weaving privacy into the fabric of your organization. Now, in applications and services and products and technical stuff, it's about weaving privacy into its functionality. So we have time to go through these if you're still awake. It's got many similarities with the OECD privacy principles. So, 1, proactive, not reactive. So you need to be proactive in how you build privacy into your processes or your technologies. So it shouldn't be Band-Aid approach. You know, Band-Aids, plasters, hospitals and stuff. Privacy as a default setting. Now, there's two things here that I think is rather fun because people get these mixed up. Privacy as a default setting and privacy embedded in the design. Now, privacy embedded in the design is what you embed at the coding level. You know, this is privacy settings. So the example that I used, even though sometimes I'm trashed for this because I use Facebook, but it's an easy thing to explain to people because, of course, people say privacy is not, you know, Facebook is not privacy friendly, but still, they do have privacy settings embedded in the design of their service. It's just they're not set as a default. Every time you set them, even when you set them, it sometimes put it back to what it was before. Yeah? Any questions about those two there? Because it's very confusing, these two, and people do get confused about it. But I think that's about the best example I can come up with that's easy for everybody to understand whether you are technical or not. Good. Full functionality. So basically, building privacy into your products or processes should not in any way deplete functionality of whatever you're trying to do. End-to-end security. So this, what it means is that the security that is used to enforce privacy in your product or service or business process should preserve the privacy from the moment it is born, right the way the personal data is born, through to when it basically dies. And you're talking about stuff like, you know, if you're talking about the rights of the data subject, and as a controller, if the data subject rings you up and requests if you collect personal data on them, what you need to have in place are the mechanisms to ensure that that individual is actually who they say they are. You need security for that. When you store data or data's traveling, you need to have encryption mechanisms in place. When you share, you know, when you have privileged user access to systems where it's stored, you need to have the authentication, authorization controls in place. You need to have the processes in place in your organization to ensure that you have a limited number of privileged users accessing your systems. You need to have the security mechanisms in place on destruction, whether you are destructing whether it's a hardware disk thing or whether you're using DRM and you're destructing the keys. Visibility and transparency. Yeah, it needs to be open about your data practices and how you're communicating, which, you know, they all hook into the OECD privacy principles. It's not rocket science. And respect for user privacy, keep it user-centric. It's all about the data subject. It needs to be easy for the user to use, the data subject to use, and to basically upfill their rights as an EU data subject. Well, not as an EU, because this actually comes from Canada. But a lady called Anne Canavan, if you want to find more out about this. But this has been also around for quite some years. And there are some documents around giving a more deep technical view on what is privacy by design, but it's still a very much evolving area, and even the technical guys and the developers are not really sure you know, what it is in its full completeness. Okay, if anyone's interested to get into privacy, never know. There is an organization, it's called the International Association of Privacy Professionals. You know, they have certifications, but you don't need to take those. You could become a member though, because they have an awful lot of really cool resources. It's www.iapp.org. And of course, if you have some younger, hungry guys in your organization or girls that, yeah, they want to do something, you think that they would be right for this, get them certified. I've taken 3 of them. By doing this, you will actually succeed in bridging the gap between your technical guys, even your business process guys, and your legal team. Okay, this is just something that I created because I was feeling pretty lonely as a technical guy in the legal field for some time. So it's like 10 to 20 hours online training. It's a social platform. You have 7 weeks to complete it, and all the stuff I'm talking about here. You know, there's two parts to it. One is the eagle, and the other is the owl. The owl hasn't been released yet, but the eagle is about privacy fundamentals, which is like the OECD and definitions and the GDPR and stuff like that. And the owl is about the tools and technicalities, which we've talked about today, but it goes into more practical examples. And at the moment, there is only one place I found that's actually doing a data protection officer type certification, and that's the Henley School of Management, which I think is rather funny because that's where I took my MBA. I tried to get in touch with them. They've actually outsourcing this function. So yesterday I've been talking to the Royal Holloway guys, and they are actually in the process of creating a module. It's like a block-in, it's a week's course, a 5-day course to put Privasee there. So you can either take it as part of your information security MSc, which is what I've got, or you can take it as a 5-day block if you just want to come along and get briefed up. And it's me that's helping them with this, and yeah, you will see me, I'll be delivering the content. But that's not official yet, that sort of developed yesterday.
Sorry, can I add to that? There was also PPP skills.
Yeah, and we should add to that because I haven't got all of them, thank you.
Yeah, that's right. PPP do run similarly 5-day course. You can do it residentially or get the paperwork and then there's an examination at the end of it. They've been doing it since 2010.
Yeah.
Anticipation of this piece of legislation, should I say, the data protection regulation. Yeah, there is that. I thought the BCS was a bit involved.
I think they are now. I'm talking to them about, I have a book that's going to be published pretty soon, so, and they're talking about doing courses and things, yeah. Yes? ICEP. You know, you take my business cards and you send me these links, because then when I'm presenting again, I can make sure that I give a complete view of all of the possible training around. I'm actually finished. Is there questions?
Go on, Gareth. Just a quick one.
Ancestry.com.
Ancestry.com.
Yeah. So I can go to Ancestry, find out how many times you've been married, what the names of all your kids are, who your parents are, where they live.
Yeah, you know, in Sweden actually, this will not be legal with the GDPR. In Sweden we have a serious problem because when I talked about every EU member state had its own interpretation of the directive as laws. Now, their interpretations have been influenced by maybe language interpretations, but also cultural things. And the third thing is also existing laws in place that could create a clash. And what we have in Sweden is something called the Freedom of Information Act, which clashes with the Swedish Data Protection Act. And what's happened is that it means that my personal data is public information. So my personal number in Sweden, which is comprised of 6 characters, and it happens to be my date of birth in reverse order, with 4 so-called, they say random characters, but in fact, you can read, I have a blog, I haven't updated for ages, but it describes how this works. The first 2 digits sort of give whether I'm a girl or a boy, and then there's 1 random number, and then there's a digit dependent upon, you know, when I was born, year type thing, or maybe when I moved into Sweden. But that doesn't matter, because if you manage to find me, it's like you go to birthdays.se in Sweden, you sort of say, oh, I'm going to send Karen some flowers, or you're just interested, or you might want to go to extracol.se, where you can find out what I earned in the last 2 financial, the reported 2 financial years with an SMS. And then you sort of think, well, I actually want to, steal her identity. You just ring up the tax board and you ask for my last 4 digits. And because they are so kind and my personal data is public information, they will actually share it with you. But please don't do that. No. So yeah, it's a problem. And there's nothing we can do now. I've tried.
I just wonder what's going to happen, certainly in the UK and the US, where this stuff is becoming more and more available.
Yeah, I actually thought in UK that you had more stronger laws. I didn't realise there was such a big, where this, that it was more that you had to opt out. It's like, I know, with your white pages, is it opt-in or opt-out? Are you in by default or out by default? So it is opt-out. Yeah, and it's really a problem because trying to find out everywhere your personal data is and then have to get in contact with all of them to opt out, it's just not doable. And this is why we have the GDPR. Well, one of the reasons.
I mean, a lot of the stuff on Ancestry is also split between the dead people thing.
Yeah.
But it's when other people provide your information on your behalf. So it's interesting to look at those implications of when other people provide and store data on behalf of another living person.
Can I ask you to put your hand up if you've got a question for Nigel?
One of the things I found was difficult to do understand
No.
was when you were talking about data with a purpose.
Yes.
Maybe because I spent all my time looking at legacy systems, looking at the data that was behind these purposes. So, I mean, a lot of what you're saying goes completely against what I do all the time.
Yeah.
I was trying to think of something really simple. So if we take the Amazon order again.
The what?
The Amazon online order.
Yes, yes.
So the Amazon online orders are being looked at. And someone says, well, I suppose someone says, well, why don't we have a nice big chart to see where all the orders are by postcode to see if perhaps we shouldn't be delivering this in the part of the country. We're not going to say that. So we've got a completely different purpose for the data.
Yeah. Well, that's a different use.
That's a completely different purpose.
Yeah. So you,
Invented a new purpose today. Time moves on. Someone's got a new purpose later.
yeah.
Are we all going to get locked up?
No, we're not. Because basically what happens is, like, for example, I was doing a PIA for, I'm often doing sort of like quick workshops for customers, and I just go in for 2 hours and we take an existing example of their environment and we sort of say, okay, we have this data set, and we take an example like what you have, and then we look at the purpose, and then what sometimes transcribes, which is quite fun actually, is you find that there's uses outside of the original purpose. And an example could be that the data collected for a single purpose has a use. It needs to be stored for 10 years because it's financial data, because of financial regulations. But then another subset of the data needs to be stored only for 5 years. And so, then you sort of find that, the way that, at least the way that I'm working, is that I'm defining, because like when you're talking is like it's an internal use, how the data is being used internally. If you're actually selling this on to third parties, it starts to go on to something else. But there you actually have a branching of use within the organization. Use is anything to do with internal optimization or the fulfillment of a service to a customer or legal obligations and all this type of thing. And you should have this defined in your privacy notice to say this is what you're doing. So if it's a new internal use that you're using this for, you actually need to say in your privacy notice that, and it's a threat to their personal data, you actually have to say that you are doing these analytics on their postcode or whatever to optimize it. Or you normally just say optimization of delivery routes or something, it would come under optimization. But, everything is sort of like different. Does that make sense? Sort of. I know what you're saying. You're saying you can get your knickers in a twist, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, I know. But yeah, that's a use. But I tie the uses to purposes. But it could be if I came into a customer and I sort of look from now and I say, yeah, this is an additional use. But then I come in and I find out going through this process and I say, well, actually, this is a separate purpose. I can't say now, but I know that when I'm going through the process, I'm able to define that. So, but what needs to be done is everything needs to be put into a tool so it's easy to reference. It needs to be integrity checked, so it can't be changed afterwards, and you have the evidence for the data protection authorities. I'm sorry, I can't make it more simple than that. But we can take a conversation afterwards, maybe. Maybe it gets more sensible. I think there's wine being served afterwards. Always gets easier with a glass of wine.
Are there any other questions?
Maybe you shouldn't record that bit, actually.
Here you go.
What's going to be the impact of offshoring, outsourcing, cloud computing?
Oh my God. Yeah, well, we're doing that already today. So today we actually have to assess all existing operations, and we're getting into these accountability boundaries and the data, personal data supply chains. You know, what is your accountability boundary? Are you the controller? Are you the processor? Are you a third party in that you have actually purchased in the personal data? If you're offshoring and you're sharing your data, you need to have it defined in your privacy notice. So everything you're doing today, you will have to have evidence of it. You will need to have it documented, and you will need to report it to the Data Protection Authority. Sorry, not a good, we said it, well, it doesn't help you basically, but that's basically what it is, yeah? Any more questions? It's nice to see some people are still awake.
I think on behalf of the law specialist group and the law specialist group, mine and our chair is the chair of the internet specialist group. I'd like to thank you, Hannah, for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. It's been very nice.
We seem to have some success with the live broadcasting, as well as obviously we've recorded events anyway, which we'll eventually able to put on our website. The live broadcasting is something we very much want to look to the future of doing, so that people who are country over the world can see our outputs. If we did successful, we certainly proved that there was a need and an audience there for people to see our activities rather than coming on here on a sneaking so we experiment still, but hopefully we'll
Yeah, but I don't know whether we will share the link. We've had a little bit of a problem with the sound today, but since it's the first time, I don't think we've done too badly. We've also got recordings on the other camera. We'll get those edited, and hopefully we'll get it up on the website. I don't know quite how long it's going to take. The other thing I should point out to any of you who have not visited here before, on the way out, when you go down in the lift, you turn to the right and press the green button to escape out the door at the end.
It's the white.
You don't go out of the door you came in.
Not green, white.
Oh, change colour, is it right?
And there's food and drink outside.
Yes, the food is now ready.
Thank you.
I have business cards here if anyone wants to just help yourself. There we go. Very good. It was great hearing. I can see that you're not a novice here.
I try not to be.
Very good. Very
I do
good.
specialise in mediation around things, so I'm a CFC.
She was standing over there.
I'll be in touch with you. I just want to...
It's been loaded all the time. Oh, right. That's what it is. Something different.
If you're sharing,
I mean, we've actually been